Section 2, Banks, Oil, Drugs, and War. Chapter 7, Drug Trafficking, a Brief Historical Overview. Of all the pieces I've written for Babel magazine, AIDS as a man-made disease, mind control projects, assassinations, and the motives behind war, none are as murky, dirty, and downright sleazy as this one about drug trafficking. As someone who in the past did every type of drug known to man, I'm well aware of what these substances can do to a person. I've also been keeping an eye on the supposed war on drugs that's been a ruse for the last 3 decades. Why is it a sham? Because factions of our own government, specifically the CIA, have been running drugs into this country since at least the 1960s on a wide-scale basis. Not only is the CIA the prime moving factor behind bringing drugs to America, but many high-level government officials know full well what is going on and have decided to blatantly ignore the problem. A brief history. The imperative word in the above heading is brief, for there have been countless books written about the drug trade. For me to do an exhaustive study would fill hundreds of pages, so I'll simply begin by saying that in the Middle Ages, drugs were used as currency, and those who possessed them wielded a great deal of economic leverage. Individuals who cornered the opium market eventually became some of the wealthiest and most influential people on the planet. They reached this state by monopolizing the shipping lanes. Sea lanes were the primary mode of transportation at that time, and thus went on to become the world's rulers. By the 15th century, nearly every drug war revolved around gold, diamonds, or the opium trade. Drugs became such a prevalent aspect of civilization. When history books refer to the spice trade, it is actually a thinly veiled reference to opium. In fact, when Christopher Columbus set sail, he was trying to find a quicker route to the Far East in order to make it easier to score opium. Along the way, he happened to stumble upon America. Speaking of our country, the Pilgrims not only moved to America in order to practice religious freedom, but also to escape Europe's cycle of drugs and ongoing wars. Across the ocean, the British East India Company was the wealthiest organization on earth at that time, and the mighty British Empire was founded on monopolizing the opium market. By the 19th century, morphine was invented by a German scientist named F.W.A. Turner between 1805 and 1817. And the syringe was developed during the Civil War. American drug running started in 1823 with a man named Samuel Russell, who began Russell and Company. This man bought opium in Turkey, then smuggled it through China. In 1830, he purchased the Perkins Opium Syndicate of Boston and established a base of operations in Connecticut. One of his primary wheeler dealers was Warren Delano Jr., who was the grandfather of FDR. By 1832, along with William Huntington, Russell formed the Skull and Bones secret society at Yale. Over the years, its members include family names such as Bush, Rockefeller, Taft, Whitney, Harriman, Pillsbury, Kellogg, Goodyear, Perkins, and Weyerhaeuser. At the same time, these people formed the nation's first intelligence operation, the Culper Ring. So, what we see is a trend that will continue throughout the future, the intermingling of secret societies, drugs, and the intelligence community. While the Skull and Bones were building their drug empire on the East Coast, 2 other events were also occurring on the West Coast. These events, the California Gold Rush in 1849 and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, were instrumental in bringing drugs to America. Chinese coolies were used as mules to import drugs into our country. Here is the pattern once again. Two of the key components that make the world go round: gold and drugs. By 1889, heroin was developed by the I.G. Farben Company, the same folks that 40 years later produced Zyklon B used to gas the Jews during World War II. Thus, the first true drug wave to hit our country occurred between 1870 and 1920. Another factor that influenced this phenomenon was World War I, which served to expand the world by moving people into areas they never would have encountered if it weren't for battle. Heroin and morphine are painkillers. Since large numbers of people were wounded and maimed during the war and were given these drugs to alleviate the pain, they became addicted. Thus, drug addiction became widespread throughout the world. By the time World War I ended, two more important factors entered the equation. First, drugs were made illegal in America during the early 1920s and also internationally by the League of Nations, thus making its distribution extremely profitable. Second, cocaine was introduced to the general public. People in the jungles had always gotten a buzz off of chewing coca leaves, but now the sensation was heightened by delivering it in concentrated powder form. In the early 1930s, consumers could no longer walk into a store and buy cocaine-laced soft drinks or over-the-counter hard drugs. Now they had to buy them on the streets. This was also the same time that the mob entered the picture. The United States entirely eradicated its drug problem during World War II because our attention was focused on defeating the Axis forces. But we had already dug a hole for ourselves by entering into an agreement with the mafia. You see, during World War II, to secure Italy, the United States government formed an alliance with the mob, specifically Lucky Luciano, who was imprisoned in New York State. Since Mussolini didn't hold the La Cosa Nostra in high esteem and tried to break them, Luciano turned to the American authorities and enabled us to ultimately dock and take over Italy during the war. As payment for his services, Luciano was released from prison and deported back to Italy after the war, where he revived the mafia and established links in the United States. This fact is very important, for after Prohibition was abolished, the mob began trafficking drugs, which had a much higher profit margin than alcohol. Also, another window of opportunity opened up after World War II because up until that point, Japan had dominated the manufacture and distribution of heroin. They used this money to finance their war efforts and also flooded China with it to undermine the country. So, between 1936 and 46, there was virtually no drug abuse in this country. But then in 1948, as an offshoot of the OSS, the CIA was formed to, quote, stop communism. In the process, they also became major league players in the trafficking of drugs. By interacting with other intelligence communities, mobsters, international dealers, and guerrillas, they soon began running drugs from the Middle East through Europe and eventually into the United States. The CIA. The real war on drugs is this. The CIA is eliminating all unwanted competition so they can have total control of running the world's drug business. It's that simple. Fletcher Prouty, the Mr. X in Oliver Stone's film, JFK, called this rogue element the secret team. This parallel government doesn't use its resources to stop the production, transport, and sale of drugs, but instead uses the drugs themselves to finance its own covert operations. Called black budgets, This money is utilized above and beyond what Congress appropriates to the CIA in their yearly budget. In other words, since this secret team has a clandestine, self-appointed mission that isn't authorized by any branch of the government, it needs to have a variety of ways to finance itself. Where does this funding come from? In addition to drug dealing, the CIA runs guns and launders money, to name just a few of their covert arts. Not only did the CIA formerly occupy their own private airline, Air America, but they also joined forces with the World Finance Corporation in Florida, which is a money laundering bank, and the Nugan Hand Bank in Florida as well. If times got rough, they could always fall back on the Vatican to run their money. No traces. While we're on the topic of front companies, there's always the Far East Trading Company that the CIA used to run opium and clean their money. And why does the secret team need all this dough? Well, there's always a need for someone to run the world's illegal operations. You know what I mean. Assassinations, financing puppet governments, laying the groundwork for wars in third world countries, quieting people who get out of line, inciting riots and then quelling them, grabbing control of states or countries that we could better operate, or hell, just creating entirely new governments. And who carries out these missions? Of course, you have the intelligence forces, those from academia, politicians, spies, bankers, and businessmen who are working on the sly. But to really get the job done, the CIA gets those people who know how to get down and dirty. Outlaws, warlords, and fanatical religious leaders. Anyone who is completely amoral and beyond the law. If you really want to read an interesting story, look into the airport at Mena, Arkansas. That was a huge drug drop-off point while Bill Clinton was governor of that state. This airport was the prime stopping area, known as A12, from South America to the United States. Or if you're really interested in what these folks are capable of, track down a series of articles written by Gary Webb that appeared in the San Jose Mercury News during 1996. These stories chronicle how the CIA flooded the Los Angeles streets with crack cocaine during the 1980s. Yeah, they're a real nice bunch of guys. Vietnam and the Golden Triangle. One of the primary reasons that America was involved in the Vietnam War, apart from the obvious profit motive, was to control and monopolize the opium trade in the Golden Triangle. We were so militarily superior that we could have won that war in a matter of months, but winning the war wasn't our objective. We had another one, to gain control of the area's opium fields and the ultimate production of the drug heroin trade. Before America ever entered Korea or Vietnam, the Golden Triangle was run by French intelligence and the Corsican mobsters. Our interest in this area began in about 1950 when we realized how important the Golden Triangle, the southeastern Asian countries of Laos, Burma, and Thailand, and the Golden Crescent, Middle East, were in terms of opium production. Burma was by far the Golden Triangle's focal point, and the CIA began infiltrating it until 1961, when our mercenaries were driven from the area by warlords in power, who recognized their country was now a major player in the international drug scene. By the late 1960s, the Golden Triangle accounted for 70% of the world's opium production. With output sky high, entire villages became totally dependent upon opium. As the Vietnam War raged out of control, 57,000 plus American soldiers were killed in those jungles, and the CIA became the largest mover of drugs in the world. While our troops were fighting, at least 15 to 30% of them became addicted to smack or China White. The CIA went in with their small planes and helicopters and reopened the transport routes that had been destroyed or made unsafe. They then moved heroin from one of the largest drug labs in the world in northern Laos via 3 different routes into Nam through the Vietnam government, then eventually to our troops. If you doubt that factions of our government were and still are involved in the drug trade, keep reading. In a Wall Street Journal article, Jonathan Coitney reveals how heroin was shipped to the United States in the corpses of American soldiers that had been killed. Their bodies were slit open, their innards removed, then crammed full of heroin, sometimes up to 50 pounds per body. They were then flown to America with priority status via the CIA's own personalized airline, Air America, where they landed at Norton Air Force Base in California. What's more intriguing about this situation is that opium stinks. It has a very distinct aroma, one that is inescapable. Thus, all the pilots, loaders, and everyone at the bases who unloaded these shipments definitely knew what was going on. The CIA became so brazen in their efforts, they even set up a brand-name soft drink company in Laos as a front operation for processing heroin. After the United States officially pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, fighting continued in this area. Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, right up through the 1980s. But after we left, guess what we left behind? Prisoners of war. Our government made a half-assed attempt via Operation Grand Eagle to rescue these men, but they didn't really want them to come home. Why? Because these guys knew too many of our dirty drug dealing secrets. Years later, Ross Perot, an ardent supporter of POWs and their families, started snooping around. He discovered a troubling situation. In a conversation with George Bush Sr., Perot said, "Well, George, I go looking for prisoners, but I spend all my time discovering the government has been moving drugs around the world and is involved in illegal arms deals. I can't get at the prisoners because of the corruption among our own people." In 1986, the infamous Burmese warlord Kun Sa stated on videotape that his country's entire supply of opium, 900 tons per year, was purchased by the United States government. Numerous individuals involved in the POW recovery movement tried notifying our government and the national media of this debacle, but their attempts rained on deaf ears. The Contra War. Prior to ever becoming involved with the countries that we now associate with the Contra War, the first area of major drug trafficking occurred in Cuba, while Batista was still in power. During that time, Santo Trafficante Jr. ran the show, and Cuba was a major pipeline for heroin coming into the States. It also harbored scores of gangsters who kept their enterprises going with gambling, booze, arms, and prostitution. When Fidel Castro came into power in the late 1950s, the mob's entire operation was shut down. Since the CIA had their fingers in the same pie for years, both of them were affected by this turn of events. After 7 or 8 unsuccessful attempts to knock off Castro between 1959 to 1965, under codenames ZR Rifle, Operation Mongoose, and JM Wave, in which they used poisoned cigars, hallucinogens, etc., to kill and discredit Castro, the CIA turned their attention to new horizons, Panama, Nicaragua, and beyond. In the late 1970s, some of the same folks who tried to snuff Castro and were used in the Kennedy assassination and Watergate burglary traveled to Central America. Headed by Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Felix Rodriguez, Frank Sturgis, and Edwin Wilson, the program had over 12,000 operatives at its height. If you do any research, you'll keep finding the same names popping up over and over again. The most recognizable personality from this era was Manuel Noriega. While head of the CIA in 1976, George Bush Sr. would routinely have lunch with the Panamanian strongman and authorize hundreds of thousands of dollars in CIA payments to him each year in exchange for his assistance in transporting contraband into America. Noriega's name also appeared on at least 50 CIA files as a drug dealer. There is even an infamous photograph of Bush and Noriega standing side by side with shit-eating grins plastered across their faces. Everything was rolling along smoothly until Noriega bucked the system and tried to become independent. Here's the scenario. Noriega would receive CIA payments for his involvement in the flow of drugs through Panama. 2. He then used this money to build a national independent network in his country. 3. He eventually tried to go solo and keep all the drug money for himself instead of transferring it to the CIA. Realizing that Noriega was out of line and unable to be controlled any longer, our government marked him as a drug lord, vilified him in the media, invaded his country, wiped away his operations, arrested him, and then put a new man in his place, someone who'd better mind his P's and Q's. Pretty simple. We even sent one of our notorious Golden Triangle high rollers, Richard Armitage, to tell Noriega that he'd better get back in line or else. Since he wouldn't see things our way, Noriega was captured and imprisoned. What a lovely business. LSD and drug companies. Reams of material have been published that document our government's experimentation with drugs on both witting and unwitting subjects, administered under the CIA's nefarious MKUltra program, and also by the Department of Defense. One thing needs to be very clear. Segments of our government were intensely involved in experimentation with drugs, and many of the agents became big-time trippers and users themselves. Below are a few random notes that expose the tip of this disturbing iceberg. LSD was discovered in 1948 by Dr. Albert Hofmann, who worked for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. At the National Institute for Mental Health in Lexington, Kentucky, under the supervision of Dr. Harris Isabel, 7 different drug addicts were administered LSD, so they continuously tripped for 77 days straight. Operation Midnight Climax was an MKUltra program in which hallucinogens were used on unsuspecting subjects to see if a Manchurian candidate could be created to become an assassin, all the while testing LSD's effectiveness in regard to brainwashing. Heroin is a trade name created by Bayer. Eli Lilly was the first company to produce synthetic LSD for the CIA. Eli Lilly is the largest drug company that produces the precursor chemicals needed to manufacture cocaine and heroin. When you think about it, you have cocoa plants and poppy bulbs, but without the necessary ingredients needed to transform them into their final state, their use would never be so widespread. Eli Lilly sends materials directly to Colombia to process their coca leaves into cocaine. And our government does nothing to stop these shipments, although they know full well what they're being used for. 2 recognizable political names of the 1990s own huge shares in this company: George Bush and the Quayle family. Conclusion: government knowledge. Drugs are used as a tool by the controllers to quell what they see as problems. To reiterate a few things. First, there are mind-boggling amounts of money to be made from trafficking drugs. The world's 4 largest industries are usury, energy, drugs, and war. Political takeovers, business empires, and personal fortunes have been built on the above 4 premises. Some people even say the CIA is the biggest drug dealer in the world. And it's no secret that their black budgets are largely financed via the transport of drugs, arms, and money laundering. The secret team's practices are also well known by all branches of the government, including the FBI, National Security Council, State Department, and DEA. And every potential investigation into it is quickly thwarted. Finally, if all illegal drugs were completely eliminated at one time, it would send the world's economy into such a tailspin it would make the Great Depression look like a day at the circus. With this information in mind, we need to look at the recent figureheads who have run this country, George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton. Elder Bush was the head of the CIA from 1975 to 76. And his link with this organization dates back to the late 1950s or early 1960s. His Zapata offshore oil rigs have been linked to the transfer of narcotic shipments from South America to the States. When the biggest drug smuggler in American history, Barry Seal, was killed by a volley of gunfire, guess whose private phone number was found in his wallet? George Bush Sr.'s. As head of the CIA, do you really think he didn't know what was going on? Come on. After Bill Clinton, his link to the Mena Airport in Arkansas is so strong, it would be easy to graduate from turning a blind eye at the state level to a national scale. Now we need to look at our current president, George W. Bush. Considering who his father is and his own cocaine party past, do you think there's any possibility that he's ignorant of what the secret team is doing? Some people may say, since everyone knows the CIA is the biggest drug dealer in the world, why not just legalize drugs? The answer is this. We can't legalize drugs because there is too much of a machine associated with it. Think about how many people legitimately make their living off of drugs. Drug companies, pharmacists, the court system, police officers, the DEA, parole officers, investigators, prisons, which are currently the largest growth industry in the country, and lawyers. It's immense. So once again, drugs equal money. Henry Kissinger said to Bob Woodward at the Washington Post, "Military men are dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns for foreign policy." This statement doesn't directly have anything to do with drugs, but it does reflect the amount of contempt the world leaders and controllers have for us. If Kissinger can talk negatively about the military, just think how he sees us, mere peasants. This comment leads to the controller's use of drugs as a tool against its own citizenry. I've done every type of drug known to man, and I'm well aware of their detrimental effects. Anyone who has been down this road will concur with me. But consider, if you will, drugs as a method to undermine the efforts of those who could potentially be trouble. What do I mean? During the late 1960s, the protest movement became such a threat to the controllers that they seriously thought it would crumble their house of cards. So what did they do? Everyone knows how prevalent marijuana use was during the 1960s. But toward the end of that decade and into the early 70s, harder, more dangerous drugs began hitting the scene, especially in one of the hotbeds of dissent, Haight-Ashbury. In the span of a few years, the scene went from loving flower children to speed freaks, junkies, and con men, all strung out and looking for an easy buck. Another example is the black protesters who wanted equal rights. Realizing these folks were serious about wanting change, what happened? The controllers began shipping heroin out of the Golden Triangle in the early 70s and pumping it into the inner cities right where the protesters lived. Soon we had our first big wave of heroin use in the early to mid 70s, and the cause quietly faded away. Of course, drugs weren't the only factor in the demise of these movements, but it was a contributor. Another example concerns the English punk rock movement of the mid-late 1970s. At that time, the economic situation in Great Britain was abysmal. Scores of angry teenagers were politically mobilized by a new musical craze, punk rock. Through the Sex Pistols, Clash, Generation X, Susie Sue, and the Banshees and others, this movement actually became dangerous to the English elite. To counter it, Johnny Thunders, ex-New York Dolls guitarist and quite possibly the most notorious junkie in rock and roll history, which is saying a lot, and Nancy Spungen, Sid Vicious' girlfriend, who was stabbed to death under suspicious circumstances, traveled to England. Thunders joined the Sex Pistols for a total death drag tour, while Nancy set her sights on and landed poor old Sid. Within months, as Johnny Thunders bragged, every punk rocker in England was a junkie. Johnny and Nancy, neither of whom had 2 pennies to rub together, still had unlimited access to smack and turned everyone on that they met. Within less than 2 years, the Pistols disbanded. Nancy and Sid were dead, and punk rock fizzled into new wave music, which was safer, more sanitary, and much more focused on money than revolution. It's a perfect Hegelian dialect at work. Thesis: dangerous political punk rock. Antithesis: destructive, readily available heroin. Synthesis: antiseptic, less threatening new wave music. My final case study involves the marijuana farmers in the hills of Kentucky, West Virginia, and the surrounding areas. These folks are mostly dirt poor locals who eke out a few extra bucks a year by growing weed up in the hill country. The government stumbled on this phenomenon a few years ago, and realizing that they had competition, decided that they'd put an end to the marijuana growers. Now, I'm not advocating the legalization or illegality of marijuana, but here is what happened. The DEA spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to eradicate little $1,000 patches way up in the hills of Deliverance Country. They'd bring in agents, helicopters, and high-tech heat-sensing equipment just to mess with these dirt farmers. But those guys in Kentucky are a resilient bunch, so they kept moving deeper and deeper into the woods, setting up more intricate traps and tip-off devices. Realizing they'd never eradicate the marijuana crops, the government took a more novel approach. Rather than fighting fair, the feds flooded the backwoods market with OxyContin, named hillbilly heroin. It seems like every partier and pharmacist in the state had a script for the stuff. These guys were getting so high on OxyContin, they didn't care about marijuana anymore. This ended the competition for the government, and at the same time made even more money off the pharmaceutical drugs. Whenever you view the subject of drugs in relation to governments, just remember their fingers are not just dirty, they're filthy. The war in Afghanistan, opium and oil. Considering how prevalent drug trafficking is in certain political and business circles, we need to ask ourselves why the United States is at war with Afghanistan. To answer this question, one thing must be made perfectly clear. The controllers don't go to war over ideals such as patriotism, freedom, or national sovereignty. Do you know why? Because these people don't give a damn about those concepts. In fact, they hold them in contempt. So why are we at war in Afghanistan? Historically, wars have been fought for 3 reasons: gold, diamonds, and drugs. As you can tell, drugs are the constant. With that in mind, let me state that in 1999, Afghanistan produced 4,600 tons of opium, which was 75% of the world's total supply. Their output accounted for 60% of the entire Afghan economy and was so prevalent that they even surpassed that of the Golden Triangle. Large portions of the CIA's black budgets are derived from drugs, along with arms and money laundering. Afghanistan was thus a very important piece of the puzzle. But then a fanatical religious group, the Taliban, came to power, and opium production virtually came to a halt. By the middle of this year, Afghanistan exported less than 100 tons of opium, or 1/50th of their previous production. Our other motivation for seizing control of Afghanistan is this. Inside Russia, there exists an immense oil field in the remote Caspian landscape that could produce enough fuel to fulfill the world's needs for over 500 years. There's only one problem. To get this supply to our existing oil lines, we'd have to do away with a tiny roadblock. It's a country called Afghanistan. The biggest problem with this scenario is that we're still relying on a form of old thought. Fossil fuels are choking our planet. Now, I don't label myself a conservationist or anything else, but we need to progress past the status quo and start developing alternative forms of energy. If General Motors and Mobil have things their way, we'll soon have 1 billion cars in China. It's great for the profit margin, but terrible for the planet. It's literally choking us to death. The other natural resources that Afghanistan has, in addition to natural gas and petroleum, are coal, copper, and zinc. If we can tap into these resources, we'll become much less reliant upon foreign countries such as Saudi Arabia, which now produces half of the world's oil supply. When you think about it, from the time of the Crusades until the 1920s, the Middle East was nothing more than a sandbox. We didn't care at all about it. But now, this area wields an amazing array of power. The horrifying aspect of their influence is that, by and large, these people are so diametrically opposed to our way of life, they truly despise us. Yet, we keep catering to them so the oil doesn't stop flowing. The scenario reminds me of the biggest kid in the schoolyard being terrorized by some scrawny little twerp. It's ridiculous. Whenever you hear media talk about the controllers setting up a puppet government in Afghanistan, just remember what's really going on. We're really only there for 2 reasons: opium and oil. To reinforce this point, I was wondering why, on October 31st, 2001, the military said they were actually running out of targets to bomb in Afghanistan. If that's the case, why don't they go in and torch all the opium fields so they guarantee no heroin comes out of there for the next couple years? It's something to think about. September 27, 2001, in the Pakistani newspaper Unmat, Osama bin Laden said, "Drug smugglers from all over the world are in contact with U.S. secret agencies. These agencies do not want to eradicate the narcotics cultivation and trafficking because their importance will be diminished. The people in the United States Drug Enforcement Department are encouraging drug trade so they could show performance and get millions of dollars worth of budget. General Manuel Noriega was made a drug baron by the CIA, and eventually he was made a scapegoat. Is it not that there exists a government within a government in the United States? That secret government must be asked, who made the attacks? I love America and think bin Laden is a rat, but he hit the mark pretty close with his comment. We should get rid of bin Laden and the Taliban first, then dispense with the controllers. Chapter 9, Warmongers, Death Merchants, and Killers, America's War Machine. Before beginning this article, I'd like to make it perfectly clear that I am not an anti-war peacenik that bows to the altar of pacifism. Instead, I take the stance that if any person's family, country, house, or personal being is attacked, they should come out shooting, throwing fists, or dropping bombs. If they don't, that person or nation will get bowled over day after day with little hope of survival or respect. With this in mind, I'd like to note that there are people and leaders in this country that are evil to the core and counterproductive to humanity as a whole. When these figures threaten us or our sovereignty, they should be dealt with in the harshest terms possible. When viewed in this light, why should we excuse a group of bloodthirsty hitmen from thrusting the United States into another war for the sheer sake of making huge profits for their respective companies or for furthering the aims of the New World Order controllers? If the following men have their way, the titles beside their names will ring true with frightening clarity. Why? Because America's war machine is gearing up once again to feed its bloodlust and greed, and the men are responsible for lighting its fuse, listed below. Richard Clark, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Paul Wolfowitz, warmonger, death merchant, killer. William Kristol, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Richard Pearl, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Dick Cheney, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Henry Kissinger, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Donald Rumsfeld, warmonger, death merchant, killer. Frank Carlucci, warmonger, death merchant, killer. James Baker, warmonger, death merchant, killer. George Bush Sr., warmonger, death merchant, killer. George W. Bush wasn't included in this because he doesn't make any decisions for himself. The list could go on to include those shadowy figures that have these men do their dirty work. But what I'd like to focus on is the visible mechanics of how our war machine operates, i.e., those who grease its wheels to keep it churning along its course. So what I'm going to do in this essay is point out how money and oil interests led us to our current situation, then how the Carlyle Group is leading us into war by using former government officials to determine public policy. The war machine. To get things rolling, here's a recent quote from Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Butler that appeared in a Monterey newspaper on 5/26/02. Of course, Bush knew about the impending attacks on America. He did nothing to warn the American people because he needed this war on terrorism. And what did this revelation bring to Lieutenant Colonel Butler? Answer: his dismissal from the U.S. military. NBC News weighed in with a similar story, reporting, only 2 days before the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington, President Bush was given a detailed war plan to dismantle Osama bin Laden's network. I could begin delving into all the did Bush know evidence, but instead I'd like to show how various characters in the public eye are tied to the war machine and the oil industry. One of these men is Richard Clarke, who has the following credentials. Chief of the CSG, Counterterrorism Security Group. Member of the Cybersecurity Task Force. Member of the Homeland Security Council. Member of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee. Coordinator, National Security Council on Counterterrorism. In other words, if anyone in America knows about security, it's Richard Clarke. In fact, it's been said that this man worked virtually day and night during 2001 in the CSG and was exposed to tremendous amounts of information on the threat of impending terrorist attacks. Clarke even commented on the intelligence data he received on the upcoming Al-Qaeda attack. It all came together in the third week of June. The CIA's view was that a major terrorist attack was coming in the next several weeks. On May 23, 2002, MSNBC confirmed that Richard Clarke advised the FAA to issue warnings about possible hijacking threats. And when did he do that? June 22, 2001. Then, on July 5, 2001, he called a CSG meeting, followed by a get-together with Condoleezza Rice and Bush Chief of Staff Andrew Card. After that, he met again with CSG, FBI, FAA, and INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services. At these meetings, he was quoted as saying, "Something spectacular is going to happen." What do you think he was referring to? The National Tiddlywinks Championship in Hoboken? Hardly. In that same month, July 2001, Clarke was also aware of a meeting between the Pakistani and Taliban ambassadors in Karachi, where they discussed rumors of an Al-Qaeda attack on America. That's 2 months before 9/11. Clarke also knew the ISI, Pakistani intelligence, Lieutenant General Ahmad instructed a Mr. Ahmad Uman Sheikh to wire 100,000 to Muhammad Atta, who was considered the mastermind of the attacks. It seems like a lot is going on, especially when Newsweek magazine reported that on September 10th, the Pentagon put its employees on high alert and then told them to cancel all flights on 9/11. Also, add this little tidbit to the mix. In July 2001, at the Group of 8 summit held in Genoa, Italy, plans were already being discussed to oust the fundamentalist Islamic Taliban from power. And who in America was promoting these plans? Well, they're cryptically referred to as Team B and include Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Richard Pearl, who holds a national security policy-making post and attended a Bilderberg meeting in 1985, Paul Nitz, National Security Advisor. Another Team B member is the Sunday morning talk show pundit and propagandist William Kristol. This guy is a CFR member, Bilderberg attendee, and publisher of the Weekly Standard, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. To place this publication in context, Rupert Murdoch is controlled by the Rothschild, Bronfman, and Oppenheimer families, who, along with Murdoch, are known as the Billionaire Gang of Four. The Kristol family also owns the publishing company National Affairs, Inc., on whose board is none other than Henry Kissinger. His name sure does keep popping up a lot, doesn't it? Essentially, then, I've listed those names because oftentimes people in this field refer to those in power as some sort of faceless, nameless entity. Well, I'll give you names. What you have to do is follow up on them by researching, reading the American Free Press, and finding out for yourself how these war hawks fit into the puzzle. Right now, it's oil and war. Those are the two primary ingredients to our current situation. Look at Lynn Cheney, wife of Vice President Dick Cheney. She recently resigned from the board of directors of one of America's premier companies, Lockheed Martin. Who are they? Only the world's largest weapons producer that sells F-16s to Oman and the United Arab Emirates, MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems to Egypt, and F-16s, C-130 transport planes, and P-3 surveillance crafts to Pakistan. All of these countries, by the way, are in or surround the Middle East. Her husband, Dick Cheney, was also on the board of TRW, another huge arms dealer, and Condoleezza Rice was a member of Chevron's board. If you start doing a little digging, you'll find plenty of these coincidences. The only problem is, why won't Dan Rather spell it out like this on the CBS Evening News? Maybe the billionaire media moguls don't want you to make the connection. Why? Because war, which results in social unrest and chaos, tends to make more people turn to their government for answers, thus laying even more power in their laps. Do you see how it all comes together? Unical. Before we proceed any further, we should return to the first phase of this mess, which is the Caspian Sea region, where $5 trillion worth of oil and natural gas resources are ripe for the picking. There is also the country of Turkmenistan, which boasts the world's third largest gas reserves and is in a prime spot to provide oil to the markets of China, India, and Japan. The only problem, there is a troublesome little country near their reserves. You guessed it, Afghanistan. Thus, the key to our current troubles are best explained in economic terms by the Indian press. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan are threatened by the Taliban that is aiming to control their vast oil, gas, and other resources by bringing Islamic fundamentalism to power. Can you see the conflict? The Taliban wanted to control the oil and opium fields also, and so did an array of American energy companies. Which ones? Well, there was Amoco, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Unical, Enron, and the UK's British Petroleum. So remember, there's a lot at stake in this part of the world because the biggest industries known to man are energy, usury, drugs, and war. And all four are ready-made to be exploited. Afghanistan produces 75% of the world's heroin supply. There is oil and gas galore, and when nations go to war, they need to borrow money at interest, usury, from the controllers' international banks. Very convenient, huh? As James Dorian stated in the Oil and Gas Journal, those who control the oil routes out of Central Asia will impact all future direction and quantities of flow and the distribution of revenues from new production. In other words, we're talking about who's going to control the future direction of the world. The timeline for this debacle began in 1997 when Central Asia Gas Pipeline Consortium proposed a 790-mile pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan. To convey how important this project is, President Clinton sent his Undersecretary of State, Carl Underforth, to meet with some Taliban high rollers in December 1997. In America, meanwhile, Unocal had tossed their dice and secured 46.5% controlling share in this endeavor. In January 1998, the Taliban signed an agreement to let a $2 billion natural gas pipeline be built from Turkmenistan to Pakistan. Keep an eye on Pakistan. They play a prominent role in this process. But civil unrest continued to plague Afghanistan, and within 1 year, by December 1998, Unocal pulled out of the deal, saying they wouldn't invest any more money into an internationally recognized government was in place. Did the words internationally recognized, do they sound eerily familiar to something that would fit into the globalist New World Order scheme? Unocal also bailed out of the Centgas Consortium, which had as one of its member companies Halliburton. Now think for a second. Who in the current Bush administration is connected to Halliburton, providing him with a $23 million retirement package? Yep, it's Dick Cheney. One of the people who acted in the role of consultant to Unocal was none other than Henry Kissinger. Here he is again. Kissinger is also associated with, among other companies, the Daily Telegraph, Hollinger, the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, the Defense Policy Board, and served as a negotiator with India for the National Security Council. Do you think old Henry K. knows what's going on in the world and is up to his eyeballs in it? Anyway, as you can see, the trouble in Afghanistan began in 1998 with a conflict between Unocal's oil interests and the Taliban's desire to maintain control of the area. Reporter Nina Burley described the situation as such: so many big deals, so much oil. All those big players with powerful connections to the Bush administration. There is a significant amount of money subtext that the American public ought to know about. As Operation Enduring Freedom blasts new holes where pipelines might be buried someday. Marty Miller, Unocal Vice President, also weighed in with this assessment. No other import project can provide such volume of natural gas to the markets of India and Pakistan at a lower price. Now we're getting somewhere. You see, India and Pakistan are currently huge markets on the rise and are slated for even bigger growth in the future due to their ability to be economically exploited. But before Unocal and Centgas could move forward with their plans, they had to overcome one roadblock: the Taliban and those who want to keep the area as their own. So, to ease everyone's fear, an internationally recognized government had to be established. To do so, the power brokers needed to take control of Afghanistan using terrorism as a guise while they kept moving eastward in their search for more oil. Pakistan. As I said earlier, the Pakistani government had a crucial interest in what's taking place in Afghanistan because this unstable country is the only thing between them and the rich oil fields of Turkmenistan. If the Taliban could be erased from this area, the flow of oil to this country would be dramatically increased. And considering how close they were to entering a full-scale war with their enemy, India, Pakistan is extremely interested in ousting the Taliban, even though they're also the world's largest supporter of terrorism. To them, a pipeline reaching across Afghanistan would be like manna falling from heaven. What makes the situation so curious is that the Taliban are primarily a thorn in the side of two major countries, America and the official Pakistani government. But guess who worked hand in hand to form the Taliban in the first place? The CIA and the ISI, Pakistan's Secret Service. As the highly regarded Jane's Defense Weekly described it, half of the Taliban manpower and equipment originated in Pakistan under the ISI, which is very much controlled by the fundamentalists. But similar to America's view of the Taliban, Pakistan's perspective also changed once they saw they were getting out of control. In fact, the only Secret Service agency not to contact our CIA with warnings of the impending 9/11 attacks was the ISI. The United Kingdom did, as did Germany, Italy, Jordan, Egypt, France, Israel, and Morocco. All of them gave us indications that trouble was on the horizon, all except Pakistan, who was the closest to them. I wonder why. Could it be that they wanted a war with the Taliban as badly as those who control our oil companies and war machine did? Even more incriminating is that Pakistani General Mahmoud Ahmad was in Washington, D.C. from September 4 through 15, 2001, during the time of the 9/11 attacks, meeting with a variety of government and defense bigwigs. To make matters even more curious, his visit with Condoleezza Rice was censored in the official White House transcripts. Strange indeed. 10. The Carlyle Group. A few weeks ago, James Baker publicly offered advice to the Bush administration on how they should proceed with their war on Iraq. What he and every newscaster or commentator failed to mention was that Baker is now employed by the highly influential Carlyle Group, which is the 11th largest defense contractor in the United States. In essence, then, we have a man trying to influence public policy while privately employed by a company that has a vested interest in activating America's war machine. If you're not familiar with them, Carlyle Group has become a powerhouse in affecting the direction in which our foreign policy takes, especially in regard to war. They accomplish this by hiring former government officials, then investing in private companies that are subject to government change, i.e., the military and telecommunications. Who, you may ask, do they employ to secure their government contracts? Well, check this list out for starters. Carlucci, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Deputy Director, CIA, 1978 to 81. Deputy Secretary of Defense, 1981 to 82. National Security Director, 1987 to 89. George Bush, CIA Director from 1976 to 77. Vice President of the United States from 1981 to 89. President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. James Baker, Chief of Staff, 1981 to 1985. Secretary of the Treasury, 1985 to 1989. Secretary of State, 1989 to 1993. Dick Darman, former White House Budget Chief. William Kennard, former head FCC. Arthur Levitt, former head SEC. John Major, former Prime Minister, Britain. Fidel Ramos, former Philippine President. Afsani Beshglas, Treasurer and Chief Investment Officer of the World Bank. Anand Panyarakam, former President, Thailand. Pol, former President, Mundus Bank. Louis Vuitton, French Aerobus Company. Park Tae-joon, former South Korean Prime Minister. Al-Walid bin Talal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, Saudi Arabian Prince. George Soros, New World Order, Bilderberg luminary, and international financier. Fred Malek, George Bush Sr.'s campaign manager. There is also one other family that invested in the Carlyle Group, but I'll keep that as a surprise for a later article. In the meantime, take a look at that list. It's like walking onto a baseball field and having the New York Yankees behind you, the best team money can buy. And I didn't mention all of the players. Carlyle also employs the former chairman of BMW and Nestle, is interviewing former Clinton cabinet members to ensure that they have both sides of the aisle covered. Plus, once hired Colin Powell and AOL Time Warner chairman Steve Case to speak at a meeting at Washington, D.C.'s Monarch House. Plus, if we look at James Baker again, we'll find that he's on the board of Azerbaijan International Oil Company, in which 2 U.S. oil companies hold 40% of the shares. Who are these companies? The first is Amoco, who has on their payroll none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski, Trilateral Commission founder, National Security Advisor for the Carter administration, globalist supreme, and David Rockefeller's puppet on a string. The second is Pennzoil, who has on their payroll Brent Scowcroft, former National Security Advisor under George Bush Sr. But the man that really brought it all together is Frank Carlucci, who holds directorships on such companies as General Dynamic, Westinghouse, the Rand Corporation, and Ashland Oil, plus sits on the board of directors of 12 other companies. Carlucci was also the college classmate of someone very closely related to our current administration's war machine, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. What relevance does this association have, you may wonder? I think it's of great importance, for in February 2001, Carlucci and Vice President Dick Cheney met with Donald Rumsfeld when the Carlyle Group had several billion-dollar defense projects under consideration. If you haven't guessed, the Carlyle Group fared quite well when all was said and done. Do you still think these ties don't matter? Philip Agee, in his book On the Run, details all of Carlucci's CIA connections, many of whom he hired with his Pentagon cronies when he joined Carlyle in 1989. And all of us know what influence the CIA has, don't we? A former Carlyle employee honed in on these dynamics when he said, "The firm understands that having Bush and Major is like having movie stars around." It's all about power and access, folks, as Oliver Burkeman and Julian Berger pointed out in The Guardian on October 31st, 2001. Carlyle has become the thread which directly links American military policy in Afghanistan to the personal financial fortunes of its celebrity employees, not the least the current president's father. Is the picture becoming clearer? Now we're getting to the bottom of America's war machine. The Carlyle Group is set to make huge amounts of money from our upcoming military conflicts and weapons expenditures. In other words, when I talk about the war machine, these folks are at the crux of it. They're the war profiteers that keep its wheels greased. Dan K. Thomason, former editor of the Scripps Howard News Service, summed it up best in March 2001. Nothing in recent history seems to approach the success this group has had in the wholesale conversion of former high government rank to gigantic profits. Peter Eisner, managing director of the Center for Public Integrity, adds, "It should be a deep cause for concern that a closely held company like Carlyle can simultaneously have directors and advisors that are doing business and making money and also advising the President of the United States." The Washington Business Journal simply says, "The Carlyle Group seems to play by a different set of rules." But who is the Carlyle Group? Well, their office is located only a few blocks from the White House, and it was founded by 3 men. David Rubenstein, aide in the Carter administration. Bill Conway, chief financial officer at MCI. Dan Dianello, financial executive at Marriott. They named their group Carlyle after a New York hotel favored by one of their first investors, the Mellon family. They now have an ownership stake in 164 different companies, have 535 investors, operate in 55 different countries, and have $13.5 billion in capital. International financier George Soros invested $100 million in them. California Public Employees Retirement System dumped $305 million into their laps. They also recently purchased Coram Bank, thus accelerating their entry into the highly lucrative Asian markets. But how did they become so successful so quickly? I'll let the Carlyle Group's company brochure answer that question. We invest in niche opportunities created in industries heavily affected by changes in government policies. Stated differently, the Carlyle Group buys what it knows best, companies regulated by the government. In fact, 2/3 of their business is either in the defense or telecommunications industries, those affected by changes in government spending or policy. And how do they affect these policies? It all revolves around access. That's the key. Basically, they operate within what is called the Iron Triangle: industry, government, and the military. A spokesman for Oklahoma Representative J.C. Watts understood the connection when he said Carlyle's strength was within the Department of Defense because they have staff types that work behind the scenes, in the dark, that know everything about the Army and Capitol Hill. Lewis, ex-director at the Center for Public Integrity, adds credence to this argument. Charles Lewis, ex-director at the Center for Public Integrity, adds credence to this argument. Carlyle is as deeply wired into the current administration as they can possibly be. On May 5, 2001, the New York Times described the Carlyle Group as such. It owns so many companies that it is now, in effect, one of the nation's biggest defense contractors and a fourth in global communications. Its blue-chip investors include major banks and insurance companies, billion-dollar pension funds, and wealthy investors. It looks like they have a firm controlling grip on both the war machine and the media. Convenient, don't you think? After reading how deeply established they are as insiders, do you think that the Carlyle Group has America's best interests at heart? Or their own, which entails capitalizing on war? An excellent example can be found in the $170 million contract that United Defense, a Carlyle subsidiary, received. And what did they get it for? To develop the Crusader, a faulty, antiquated, horrendous product that was described by Eric Miller of the Project on Government Oversight as follows. The Crusader has been the GAO's Government Accounting Office poster child for bad weapons development. The Crusader project was so malign that the government was set to drop it completely. But lo and behold, what happened? War was on the horizon. Carlyle pulled a few strings and voila, a $470 million contract was thrown Carlyle's way for the Crusader. Funny how things happen, huh? If that's not bad enough, the Carlyle Group is also the financial advisor to a certain government. Who? Saudi Arabia. In fact, they make nearly $50 million per year training the Saudi Arabian National Guard, troops that are sworn to protect the Saudi royal family. Now, if all hell breaks loose in the Middle East, and considering that Saudi Arabia is tentative about supporting our efforts against Iraq, who do you think the Saudi soldiers will kill? Their own kind, Arabs, or the invading white American devils? If you ask me, we've entered very treacherous waters, all for the sake of making money off of warfare. Regardless of what they say, these men in the Carlyle Group epitomize a very nefarious form of evil via their actions. Chapter 11, The Bush-Bin Laden Family Connection. When I wrote about the Carlyle Group having an inordinate amount of access to the current administration, which is used for their own personal gain, some people may not have realized the general importance of this situation. So, to begin showing you how closely the Carlyle Group is interconnected with both the Bush and Bin Laden families, let's start at the beginning. In the early 1990s, the Carlyle Group, out of the kindness of their heart, chose to take a struggling businessman under their wing and give him a position in their company. But this wasn't just any old job. No, they put this individual on the board of one of their subsidiaries, Cater Air. That would be commendable in most instances, except that this employee wouldn't be categorized as one of the most brilliant men in the world. But that didn't matter because the person in question who landed this gravy job was none other than George W. Bush. Yep, to keep him occupied until he could be selected to his future job as governor of Texas, the Carlyle Group lent a helping hand. But lo and behold, one hand quickly washed the other, for after George W. became governor, he appointed several people to a board that controlled the money invested by the Texas Teachers Pension Fund, a total of $100 million. So this board decides to invest this public money with a certain group. Guess who it was? Yep, you're right, the Carlyle Group. In addition, another entity, the University of Texas Board of Regents, invested millions of dollars too. And guess which way it went? I'll be damned, but it also went to the Carlyle Group. So let's see, Texas, Bush, money, and the Carlyle Group. A mere coincidence? Who knows? But I'm reminded of that old saying, follow the money. A case in point is Wayne Berman, a Washington consultant and George W. Bush fundraiser, who got kickbacks of $900,000 plus after Connecticut State Treasurer Paul Sylvester pushed tens of millions of dollars of state pension funds to the investment portfolio of a certain group. And which group would that be? Yep, Carlyle. Are things starting to smell a little fishy? Maybe it doesn't matter that oil companies gave 13 times more money to the Bush campaign in 2000 than they did to Gore, and that electric companies gave 7 times more. And this is coming from someone, me, that wouldn't vote for Al Gore if my very life depended on it. Hell, I wouldn't want to vote for George Bush either if my life depended on it. The point I'm trying to make is that there are tons of dirty dealings and shenanigans going on behind the scenes that aren't getting reported in the mainstream media. Don't believe me? Well, how about this one? In December 2001, Frank Carlucci and James Baker, both Carlyle representatives, met at the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. for their annual investor conference. Also in attendance were the representatives of another important family that had invested huge amounts of money in the Carlyle Group. And what family were these individuals from? Hold your breath. But it was the Bin Laden family. Worse, another famous politician was rumored to be at this same meeting after he spent the night at the White House with George W. Bush. And who was it that supposedly met with the Bin Laden family after spending the night at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Answer, George Bush Sr. Things are here, huh? Well, Larry Klayman, spokesman for Judicial Watch, comments on this subject. The idea of the president's father, an ex-president himself, doing business with a company under the investigation by the FBI in the terror attacks of September 11th is horrible. President Bush should not ask but demand that his father pull out of the Carlyle Group. Tom Fitton, president of Judicial Watch, echoes this sentiment. For the father of our current president to be doing business with foreign governments, there is a clear conflict of interest. Now, some of you may be wondering, hey, did I read correctly a couple paragraphs ago that the Bush family was doing business with the Bin Laden family? Regrettably, yes, you did. Here is the story. Back in the early 1970s, when George Bush started his first company, Arbusto Energy Inc., his first business partner was Salem bin Laden. Yes, Osama bin Laden's brother. This fact is confirmed by the United Kingdom's Daily Mail, which wrote that Salem bin Laden invested heavily in Bush's first business venture. Salem is also a close friend of Saudi Arabia's King Fahd. Now, some may say, hey, that was a long time ago. Let bygones be bygones. But how does that account then for George Bush Sr.'s meeting twice with the Bin Laden family prior to the 9/11 attacks? The second time being in January of 2000. Or how the Bin Ladens have been frequented by Bush, James Baker, and Frank Carlucci over the past few years in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Charles Freeman, president of the Middle East Policy Council, has said of the clandestine relationship, if there were ever any company closely connected to the U.S. and its presence in Saudi Arabia, it's the Bin Laden Group. They're the establishment Osama's trying to overthrow. This information changes the entire complexion of the war on terrorism, doesn't it? The bin Laden family initially invested $2 million into the Carlyle Group, but that's only what's been seen. A foreign investor with ties to the bin Ladens told the European Wall Street Journal on September 28, 2001, that the family's overall interest with Carlyle is considerably larger. And according to the Wall Street Journal on September 27, 2001, guess who brokered these deals between the bin Ladens and Carlyle? Good old George Bush Sr. So, due to the touchy nature of this relationship, the bin Ladens pulled their investment money out of Carlyle in October 2001. But let's stop for a moment and examine the situation. George Bush has invested money into the Carlyle Group and is also employed by them. Likewise, the bin Ladens were substantial investors of the Carlyle Group and have had business ties with George Bush for 30 years, since the early 1970s. Now you have to ask yourself, how does the Carlyle Group derive a large percentage of their revenue? Answer: from foreign military contracts and America's war machine. Zeroing in on this sinister configuration of forces, the Wall Street Journal on September 27, 2001, in their special report, Aftermath of Terror, section stated, if the United States boosts defense spending in the quest to stop Osama bin Laden's alleged terrorist activities, there may be one unexpected beneficiary: Mr. bin Laden's family. Is it starting to sink in yet? George Bush Sr. is tied to the Carlyle Group and America's war machine like the spots on a leopard. And guess what? His son, the current president of the United States, wants to do within the next month or so: wage another war in the Middle East. And the bin Laden family, former investors in the Carlyle Group, also have a direct family member acting as key player in this scenario: their brother, Osama bin Laden. Sons, brothers, business ties, investments, the Carlyle Group, huge amounts of profits to be made, oil pipelines running across Afghanistan, and America's war machine. Do these connections and interrelated coincidences stink to high heaven? You better believe they do.